Okay, so I've spent a little bit of time talking about the different kind of stories that make the news, and now I want to break it down quite a bit further and detail to you exactly the different kinds of stories and the different criteria that is set by different mediums. So, within your business, for example, you might have a story that is perfect for a national publication. You might have a story that is ideal and really lends itself to online media. Or you might have a really nice, really quirky local story. So, the whole purpose of this element of the course is that you understand and you make sure you're targeting appropriately the different types of media out there, because you might find that actually you have your business within the stories in your business lend themselves to a few different mediums. So, this really breaks down what the different types of journalists look for so you can ensure that when you're pitching your story, you're pitching it right. So, starting with the right stories for the right media, focusing on national. So, I'm talking about national press and national broadcast media. So, straight away, okay, here's an acid test. They only want the groundbreaking things. A UK first or an international first if you're in the UK. If, for example, you're in the US, they'll want a US first. So, that's not necessarily the only thing they go for, and I'm going to go into the different elements. But just to give you an idea, if you're talking about a product, it really does have to be up there and it really does have to add some real value. So, for example, if you're developing an app, which is the example I've referred to previously, is it new? It's what I've referred to in the questions to ask yourself. Is it new and is it a national first? Is it something that hasn't been done before? Is it a game changer in your industry? Because the thing to bear in mind is when you go national with a story, unless it's sort of a feature as opposed to a news story, you are up there, you are competing with um, stories across the nation. So it has to be something that's of relevance to the readers and relevance to the readers and our viewers nationally. So think about your product, think about your service. Is it groundbreaking? Does it fulfill this criteria? Okay, I've touched upon this before. Strong human interest angles are absolutely key. Stories need to be relatable, and case studies really add value to this. So, for example, if you've launched a new product, how is it helping your ideal customer? Do you have an ideal customer that has been through the process of using your product, and what have been the effects on him or her? That's where it really comes to life. So, quite often when I'm pitching a national story, and I think I mentioned I spent a lot of time in the healthcare sector. When, for example, I was pitching a case study that was unusual, or should I say a treatment that was unusual, quite often the journalist would come back and say, that's great, have you got a case study? Because one of the things is they want to actually illustrate the story through an individual, because, or a thing, if you've got a service, for example, that isn't for people, it's to do with businesses, but essentially they want to bring it down to the human interest angle. So rather than you getting in touch saying, I've got this fantastic product, they'd be interested in hearing it from someone else just to further verify the basically all the benefits you're talking about with your product or service. Themes that tap into a national debate. So think about what's going on in your country. Think about what is the general feel. So here in the UK, for example, we have junior doctors striking. So that's a national issue that everybody's talking about. We're in interesting political times right now. Of course, that moves and changes. So people's political views are being brought to the fore. We're talking about there's a lot of noise around small businesses and is the current government supporting them and what are the benefits out there. So, with all these things, think about where you can add to the conversation. So, with your product or service and the need that it's catering for, does it tap into a national debate or can you add value by saying something different to the national debate? So, to further give you an example, and this, by the way, is totally doable. It's not sort of a far up there kind of thing that you'll never get an opportunity of getting media coverage with, because quite often, and I've mentioned this in a previous element of the course, quite often when it comes to a big story, journalists are looking for speakers. So they're looking for somebody who's going to be able to voice or add an expert opinion to the issue. So, an example might be if you're an accountant, it might seem like quite a sort of dry subject, but what about when the budgets come out? What about when new tax regulation comes out? Is there something that you can say that's of value? So, quite often it doesn't have to be that if you don't tick the first two boxes of the groundbreaking stuff or the human interest angles, can you add to an existing debate? Can you add to a national debate? Can you add to the themes that are really current in the current in the media climate, and really current and really being felt strongly in the country? If you can, then that's potentially an option for you getting into the dialogue and getting yourself coverage. Okay, so this is just an etiquette type of thing and the kind of thing to expect when you're pitching to a national journalist. So it sounds quite straightforward, but I will explain to you it's different to regional and local journalists and some online for that matter. So expect the journalist to follow up, want interviews, and take their own pictures. So, one of the things I've noticed in my time as a PR and as a former journalist is when it comes to, for example, the local media, and I'll talk about this in more detail shortly, but when it comes to local or the regional media, quite often they're happy to take your content as is. So as long as you get an amazingly print-ready press release or story for them, they're quite happy to then use that if they feel that it's truthful, if they feel it's relevant to their publication and it strikes the right tone. With national, I don't know a situation where a national journalist has covered one of my stories word for word off the back of my press release, no matter how beautiful it's being crafted. Because, as a general rule, journalists, their editor expects them to follow up and do their checks and balances and get exclusive content, exclusive interviews and angles to make sure that their story is verified, that what they're saying is true, that they have their own pictures that they own the rights to, and essentially they're very thorough in making sure that they have the story from their angle. They're commissioned to write, and often, just as an aside, but for your information, often a lot of the journalists nationally are freelancers, so they're expected to write it all up and do their homework and not just use a press release. So that's something to bear in mind, that if you send over a press release and they're interested and they want to follow up, they may well ask for an interview, it's quite likely, and they may well want to arrange a time to take pictures, whether it's of yourself and your product or whether it's of a case study you've put forward. But yes, they will certainly do the groundwork to get the editorial right. So again, I think I've mentioned this when I talked about how journalists operate, in that they're very short on time. They do not have the hours in the day to indulge someone talking war and peace about their story. It needs to be pitched very concisely, and the top information has to be front and center of the story. So it needs to be really easy for them, and I think this is something that you should actually adopt for any publication when you're pitching, but I would say certainly for national, because a good way of thinking about it is that the sort of higher you go up when it's from going from local to regional to national, the more you're competing in their inbox for their attention, the more you're competing for them to open your mail with other press releases out there, other pitches that have been sent to them. So you need to make sure that your story is very tight and concise, and the top line is enough for them to say, right, I want to find out more. Okay, so I'm using the example of the UK again, but essentially, for whatever country you're in, they're interested in the locally national issues. So, for example, if you're in the US, they're only interested in US issues, but they will invite comment or features on international issues. If you're in Australia, they'll be interested in Australian issues, but will invite comment or features on international issues again. So, to give you an example, open any of your national newspapers, they'll have a section where, it's stories about the country primarily. So if you're in the US, it's all about the elections right now. If you're in another, if you're in Australia or if you're in the UK, we've got our own political news right now. However, they do have a space for world news and features, so that is something to bear in mind, that your story potentially has legs outside of your own country if you can position it right. Crucially, and I'd say this is really important, don't take a one size fits all approach. So I would, this is really important for all publications, but no more so than national. That as a national newspaper, they all have different leanings, different, political views, they have different audiences, and they have different styles of writing. So, I've used the example here of the Times, whichever country you're in, which is sort of quite detailed. It's got a lot on, maybe it's got a lot on financials, it's got a certain level of writing, and then you compare to something like the Daily Mail, which is a bit more consumer leaning as a newspaper. So, with that in mind, it really won't do to send one press release blanket to all the publications, unless, of course, you've got something like an international first, and then they might be scrambling for your story. But even then, you'd want to make sure you've pitched it correctly. But essentially, don't take a one size fits all approach. Do individual pitches and make sure that you position yourself correctly for that publication, which is a learning that you can take for any kind of pitching you do. And I guarantee if you do that, it greatly increases your chances of getting quality coverage. So, next, we're going to look at examples of national stories, many of which I've worked on, and hopefully that will give you some real context in terms of where all these points fit in.